Okay, start again.
Yeah, you go ahead.
You have the question?
Yeah, I got him.
We just did a Sundays with Stories, and it segues into the Q&A that we're simultaneously recording. And I'll tell you how. One person wrote in and said, well, wait a second, Stanton. If you believe that addiction's not biologically generated and people's experience cause it, then how really do you differ from Gabor Mate? At some point, you can read the actual question. Sometimes I wonder about these questioners, are they really cozying up to us, or are they really undercutting us? But
always undercutting that thing.
In the Sundays with Stories, we talked about a young man who self-identified as having PTSD, ADHD. His father doesn't, is out of his life. He lives in a violent neighborhood. He's got the whole collection of traumas, and he doesn't want to define himself that way. And so I'll tell another story from my memoir. I've told this before. I was speaking in Vancouver, and I arranged to meet with Gabor for brunch or something. When I say that, I just have to laugh to myself. I wrote this up for a previous magazine, substance.com, for Will. It's somewhere on my website now. And Will introduced it by saying, I lead a terribly dull life. And I say, Will, cut that bullshit out. People aren't going to believe that everybody goes to Vancouver and, meets for a rendezvous with Gabor Mate. And Will says, you always say that about what a dull life you said. And I said, oh, for God's sake, it's some kind of self-pity bullshit I parade. We're not going to write it down. But when I went there, I was aware that Gabor Mate and I do share some ways of thinking. We both believe that childhood and other experiences create who you are. Now, the questioner got you can read the question, but
let me read it, may I?
Go ahead.
I think now I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So I have a secret about this question, but I'll tell you after when we're not recording. If parental traumas, is that the one?
Yes.
If parental traumas and adverse events aren't sufficient explainers of addiction, then why do you focus so much on positive and healthy parenting as preventing addiction? Shouldn't it follow that they would have equal significance or non-significance in a person's life? In other words, if you're saying, well, cut out the trauma talk, you have to live your life, then why do you make such a big deal out of positive parental roles having to do with somebody's life and their future and who they are?
How would you answer that one, Zach?
Well, there's a couple ways, but let's say I could even answer it by, I could even grant like a trauma theorist and still answer it well. Trauma happens, negative events happen. And it's not that when those things happen, the point is not to let your belief system say that, oh, now it's created some biologically different thing in me. It's to say, all right, since those happened, how do I incorporate this? How do I learn from this? What advantages has it brought, even if it's a bizarre way to think about advantages? And so when you talk about positive roles of parents, well, you're sort of doing the same thing. You're saying, I remember, well, so your trumpet playing friend who we met, a jazz musician, talked about his father and how he gave him, words of wisdom, and you thought that was pretty interesting. And you talked, and
he had an identical twin brother who died when he was a sophomore in college out of something like leukemia.
So okay, so that you have the two factions right there. So his brother died, and that gave him the impulse, that maybe an extra push to do something that he loved, because he thought, wow, this is my twin brother. Life really is short. Anything could happen. I should do things that I enjoy and that I love. Simultaneously, his father gave him an idea about their own relationship. You don't have to love me, but the essential thing is that what was the was
You
the
can
second part
stand
of
on
that?
your own 2
That's
feet.
stand on your own 2 feet. So you thought that was really interesting, and that's like a positive parental role. You could take that a few different ways, but and the reason why you would want to listen to that, think about it, and incorporate that in your life, and why you would make a big deal out of it is because that very experience is the kind of experience you want to say, to let guide you and shape you. Neither of those things are biological. Both of those are common sense and just how you take a perspective on the world. So I don't think it contradicts to focus on one and not the other.
But his father, so first of all, I never, the questioner, there's a couple of danger signs, and he says parental trauma. I don't know what parental trauma is, and I never use that phrase. And then he says adverse events. I never use word there's something called adverse childhood events, which Finati has developed as a model of early trauma that Gabor relies on. Those early childhood events take place when you're quite young, and they're very specific. They're parental divorce, which seems pretty low key, crime in the family, drug abuse in the family, actual abuse of the child, sexual or otherwise. They're specific things. And all of us know those aren't good things. But let's take the mix that we've talked about. John's father did convey an attitude towards John. And that attitude was one of competence and being able to display and manifest skill in dealing with life. And, you're not going to be a jazz musician without having come to grips with a few practical problems of life, making a living. His wife is a musician. There's a couple of other things. The person who was with you and me at that meeting, our good friend Sean, sent us a clip by Kurt Vonnegut where he was on an archaeological dig, which sounds kind of privileged. And one of the anthropologists said to him, "Oh, what do you do?" And he says, "Oh, well, I do sports and I do music and art, but I'm not good at any of them." And the Vonnegut says, this archaeologist changed his whole life view. He says, "I don't think that. I think you're a lucky human being who has a lot of interests that you're positively involved in. You don't have to be. You can't be great in all of them." So that's one. So that wasn't his father, but that was somebody who gave him a different outlook on what a positive experience. John is a very positive, the guy, the trumpet player you met, is just a very positive person. He just welcomes life. He welcomes the people he knows. He tries to help people. He loves his music. And so the issue isn't, we believe, and we write in Outgrowing Addiction, that parental attitudes are extremely critical, but they go far beyond not performing trauma in the child. I mean, everybody knows that most people who are addicted didn't undergo specific traumas. Everybody knows that extreme traumas are bad for people, but what that doesn't capture the reality of A, who becomes addicted, and B, who becomes better. And you just expressed that by marshaling your skills and not seeing it as Gabor presents a disease theory, that trauma permanently, he calls it epigenetics, and it permanently alters your brain and explains why you become an addict. That's what you and I disagree with.
So the thing is, trauma doesn't, you don't have a traumatic experience or a certain level of trauma, and then at that threshold, there's an addiction microchip that lives inside of you, and then now you can't get rid of it. It's more that people undergo a range of traumatic events or adverse events in their lives, I guess, some worse than others. And what you need to do, and what people often do without being told they need to do it, is take a perspective that these things make them who they are. They give them the knowledge of things about the world and what could happen and what's possible, and somehow turn that into, give it a positive spin so that you can build yourself up. And the thing about you talking about positive parental relationships insofar as you do is that you're saying, well, you already are kind of a step ahead there. You don't have to do any new perspective taking if you have good guidance. You sort of can just kind of run with that perspective. Neither are better or worse. It just is a method of getting you to a place in your mind where you want to be, and
this is another example. Parents know that.
Yeah.
I mean, most privileged parents understand they want their child to feel good about themselves, and they want them to follow their interests and develop skills in that particular area so they can create a positive foundation in life. Right. So we're talking about the New York Times, and this is a segue to those who saw our Sundays with Stories. There's a young man who writes in about his college applications. He comes from a neighborhood, I would think it was an urban neighborhood, where there was violence. He grew up without a father. He had PTSD. He has ADHD, but he didn't want to write about any of those things. So he's on his own come to the opposite of the Gabor trauma creates all conclusion. He doesn't, mention his mother, but there was another article in the Times that, I enjoy reading the New York Times. There's a woman, forgive me, I don't know her name. She was the most valuable player in the WNBA twice. She's 6'4". And she was like 6 feet tall when she was in 8th grade. Her mother's 6'2" and her father's 6'6". And that's a tough road to hoe. You know what I mean? When you're a kid, being taller by a ton than everybody else. Mm. And she describes her mother saying to her, honey, just don't worry about what other people say. You've got to you can't be like other people. You've got to be who you are. And being tall is a gift. I mean, and she actually describes, I'm going back now, we talked about in Sundays with Stories, Sarah Silverman, who was on antidepressants for, I think, almost a decade. A doctor wanted to give this woman, this basketball star, hormone treatment so that she would shrink, not grow anymore. Oh my God. And so she became who she became. I think she's married now. She's a superstar. I believe she makes a good living. She's got and one thing she said, John, the man we had, the jazz trumpeter, talked about his identical twin brother who died of leukemia. And in a way, as horrible as that was, they were very close. They played trumpet together. It liberated him, as you described. He said, God, you can die at any time. Mm. If I'm going to be a musician, I'm just going to have to try for it. The woman basketball player has an older sister who, it's not right to say she's developmentally disabled. She has a host of paralytic problems. She's autistic. She, I think she had multiple sclerosis. I mean, and she's incredibly close. The basketball player is incredibly close to her. It's almost, and she's, I think, blind and deaf. So the woman basketball player is almost her link to the outside world. They must communicate by, just like when twins grow up and they're totally left together alone. She can, I guess, interpret her sister's thinking and behavior and actions, and they're just completely bound together. When she's not playing basketball, which occurs during, she goes home and she's the principal caretaker for her sister. So that John and this woman both had family traumas. I mean, Gabor could certainly make hay with either of those things. And in both of their cases, it contributed to them becoming a better, more fully formed human being that allowed them to do what they wanted to do, but also to care for other people. So we are aware of parenting as a critical influence. We see positive parenting as an essential positive thing, although people overcome negative parenting. For people to develop a positive outlook in life and a positive view of their capabilities. And the critical, most important thing is where anti-trauma makes you a lifetime victim.
Here's another one. Can people become addicted to isolation? And it says,
I didn't quite 100% understand that question. Well, let's
Anyway.
I can combine the answer. Read the other question about the pandemic. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking that too. We almost call this the same question and call it a day. This one is it says, granted, meaning, purpose, and community prevent addiction. How do you suggest that people find these things in times of COVID lockdowns and political hatred?
Well, as I often say, I'm writing my memoir, and mine is going to be among the first post-pandemic memoirs, because, I wrote it primarily during the pandemic year, and we're still sort of in the pandemic. And so I agree with the questioner. Isolation and lack of community and not being involved in the earth outside of yourself are very negative experiences. And I think some children are really suffering as a result of that. I've also read, there was one letter to the Times where a mother said, maybe I'm a bad mother, but I think kids don't really suffer as much from COVID, and they don't get it outdoors. So I let my kids go outside and play at the playground. And, I have grandkids. I have adult kids. I believe I would do the same thing, because I think independent experience is critical. And at this point, that's what I would do. On the other hand, the other thing I would say is, just as the drug deaths and mental health illness cyclone existed before the pandemic, it's due to things prior to the pandemic. And in the 2019 World Happiness Report, there's a section by a woman named Twenge, I think it is, Twenge, describing there's been a plummeting of adolescent and childhood happiness, contentment in life. And she attributes it to the proliferation of video entertainments and video games. And she just tells a story which rang a bell for me. When I always say this, I'm very old. People used to worry. I grew up before there were, or just when they were starting to have shopping malls. And parents used to worry about their kids going to shopping malls. That doesn't happen now. Even before the pandemic, kids lay in their room and they communicate entirely through cell phones. So, and some of the same types of parents are saying, is this good? I mean, I don't know what the hell was going on at the shopping mall, but is never leaving your room a really good thing? So my point is, prior to the pandemic, the loss of community and isolation, the lack of independent experience, which is a critical factor that you and I identify as allowing people to avoid addiction, have become worse. And that's not a good thing. And so my response to that is, I don't think mental health indicators are going to improve on their own, and drug deaths have not improved during the pandemic. On the other hand, like everything we say, we're going to have to deal with that reality, and there are ways to deal with that reality. And we might point out the Life Process program. Everybody has become the Life Process program, which is an online addiction coaching service that you and I are principal providers in. And that's one way to communicate with people. It's a way. We have groups, but we also encourage as much as is possible. I can't speak for all the coaches, but we're very much oriented towards encouraging people to go out and experience and expand their experience. And that's going to be a sliding scale. I mean, we're not going to tell people to go out with masks or without masks, or if they're high risk people, we're not going to tell them that. We're not going to tell parents, oh, let your children cross the street or ride their bike downtown. We're not going to tell anybody anything like that. We're not going to tell people give up your jobs and, become a baseball player or a writer or an archaeologist, we're going to tell people, think through what it is you would like in life and be most contented with, like Hannah Einbinder or like John, my trumpet playing friend, and do the best you can to realize and approach that part of your life as best you can. And with your children, give them as much independent experience and challenge yourself as you feel comfortable doing. Maybe push yourself beyond where you would go on your own. And there's always a better or worse way to deal with the situation. And new forms will evolve around the pandemic to allow people to experience community, to develop their skills, and to avoid isolation. Which gets back to the isolation question. I'll just say two things about, being isolated isn't a good thing. Okay. However, obviously people talk about, a big thing they're talking about in New York City and elsewhere is where they place people in isolation cells. And, I wouldn't do very well under those conditions. But, and let me jump to Rat Park. Rat Park is actually a study of how rats behave in isolation versus behaving socially. That's the study. They put them in an individual cage where they have no other rat, and limited activity, and then they drink a lot of morphine solution. And in Rat Park, with a lot of other rats of both genders and ability to run around, they eschew. So that's a real thing in life. On the other hand, I'm aware of people who've been in isolation cells and had experiences like that, and they've endured them. A typical thing is they'll map out a plan they'll march back and forth in their cell daily. They'll stay in shape. They'll do push-ups. They'll rehearse historical things in their life. There's a man named Curtis who was a poet in Hungary. He wrote My Happy Life in Hell. I spoke in Budapest, Hungary. And somebody gave me a book and said, "You'd like that?" God, I did like it. And what happened was he escaped the Nazis. He's Jewish. He returned when the communists took over, and they put him in a prison camp. So, some people had things tough, you know what I mean? And in the prison camp, every night he organized a group, and there were working class guys. You could run afoul of in Nazi Germany. If you were Jewish, you were in trouble. In communist Russia, there was a lot of ways to get in trouble. You could be a union guy, but you weren't a communist, boom. And every night they had labor during the day. He would organize a storytelling session where each person, every human being in that group, would tell some story about their life, and express some point of view they had, maybe give a speech about what their outlook in life was. And that became the hit of the prison camp. He was in there for a couple of years. And everybody wanted to join his prison gulag group. So however dire a situation is, there's a way to make it more positive than negative. You and I are not, we're not going to cure the pandemic. That we can snicker just to even suggest that. We're not going to cure isolation in society. We're not going to cure children's reliance on video games, but we are going to always incrementally try and help people as human beings and as parents, and you work with children, expand their horizons in view of themselves and their options in life as much as possible.
So isolation, like drugs, is not necessarily good or bad. I mean, you gave some examples of how you can thrive in, let's just say, in being by yourself instead of isolation, because that's got the negative spin on it. It's the reason for it matters, and your perspective of it matters. So are you
well, I wouldn't do it to anybody. It's a form of torture.
No. But I'm saying if somebody with free will and the ability to do something like go socialize, or have experiences on your own, be part of culture, whatever it is, but you're worried to do that either because of, I don't know, something of self-esteem, or that you're afraid something might happen to you, so you just sort of get cozy and do the proxy for those things, so you're texting or playing video games instead of that you might call something like that an addiction. Isolation, like you described, some of the most famous books of people, Nelson Mandela or whoever, being completely isolated. We no one would say, "Oh, that's totally positive." Isn't it great that they were in a holding cell with no one to talk to, or imprisoned by, they're in a gulag somewhere. But there's a difference between that and being addicted. That's a whole new set of problems that sort of usurps
that you would add on
is.
to it.
Right,
And
exactly.
I personally wouldn't have drunk the opium solution, I don't believe, in the isolated cell. If I take drugs, I have taken drugs, and I drink, I personally don't think I would completely hone in or my consciousness with drugs and alcohol, even under, well, who knows what the worst circumstances are.
Yeah.
But under an isolation situation, I would try and still continue to use my physical and mental resources, I believe. There's a famous movie that I've watched a million times. It stars Dustin Hoffman and another guy. It's the French word for butterfly. It's a guy who gets sent to the penal colony, in the French penal colony, which is a barren island. And he's always running afoul of the authorities, and they're always throwing him in isolation cells. And they're not kidding around, you know what I mean? And he just, he exercises. They have him, I don't know. I read the book. He eats cockroaches to keep up his strength. And every time he comes out with fewer teeth, but bloodied but unbowed. So society's goal isn't to torture people, Lord willing, although it often ends up that way. But people can endure just about anything.
Movie is Papillon or Papillon.
Papillon.
Yeah. Papillon.
Yes, thank you. God bless you.
I looked it up. I didn't.
And who was the male who played Papillon? Dustin Hoffman was Papillon's friend. Right, so we did a few Q&As, and they tie into Sundays with Stories. And,
we got one more.
Okay.
If you can handle it. We've been on a while.
If I can survive in a holding cell in my fantasies, I guess I can answer one more question.
If you do this, I'll offer you an opium solution. Okay. Is your definition of addiction simply a self-destructive involvement or relationship? If so, then why not just call it that and ditch the word addiction? I know you wrote an article about this. The way that you that way, wouldn't it distance you from all of the people who use the word improperly? And if that's not your definition of addiction, then I'll look forward to hearing what more there is to your conceptualization, because no doubt it'll be.
Well, that's a constructive question.
Yeah,
First of all, I mean, when you say addiction, everybody kind of knows what you mean.
Right. Everyone's somewhere in the understanding.
In the ballpark. They do think of heroin addiction, but if you expand people's consciousness, and when you say, well, they're addicted to another person, they kind of know where you're going.
Right.
You're involved with somebody, and it's a destructive involvement. So
right.
In terms of his definition or her definition, it's not just a destructive involvement. It's an all-encompassing destructive involvement. In other words, if you bite your nails, you would kind of call that a bad habit. It's not going to probably, ruin your life and your health. You're not going to die from it. You're not going to lose a job. You're probably not going to, get divorced. I mean, it can be pretty bad, but yeah. And so we list the criteria for addiction. It's an overwhelming involvement that provides gratification and by fulfilling key needs, self-esteem, a feeling of comfort, but it has a destructive impact on you, so that you need to return to that experience as your sole source of gratification. And we add in as a sixth thing, it's a continuum. So we don't, a biological model of addiction says, oh, boom, you're addicted now. Oh, look, there's a place in your brain. And that's bullshit. There is no addict place in your brain. There is no thing that you can look at and look at somebody's brain, which Hart points out. That's addiction. There are reward structures that impact what you do, but there's no you're on or off addict button. And of course, Alcoholics Anonymous used to have that typical crazy thing. You're either pregnant or you're not. You're either an alcoholic or you're not. So when somebody comes in and says, well, you know, I got a DUI, am I an alcoholic? They only have one category. You're an alcoholic or you're not an alcoholic.
Right.
They don't have a, well, that wasn't a good idea to drink and drive. They don't have that. So addiction occurs along a continuum, and there are some people that die from it. You know, we talked about, there was a presidential candidate, George McGovern, whose daughter died on the street. People die from it, so it's not nothing. On the other hand, virtually everybody's strung out in some lesser degree along the continuum. And the most important thing about that is I use the term addiction. We don't use the term addict because we don't believe that somebody's a pinpoint on that continuum. And, oh, here's where you are. We believe that you're able to move, sometimes, unfortunately, you move in the bad direction, become more addicted. But in general, people move in a positive direction and become less addicted. On our Sundays with Stories, you know, I read from Gene Heyman, who said usually by their early 30s, most people have, he doesn't use the word matured out of addiction. And so we cease to use the word addict, but we do use the term addiction and addicted because it describes an experience that everybody, it's a universal experience, is what we argue. And it can grow better or worse. And everybody kind of knows where you're coming from. If I say to somebody, you know, well, that was an addictive relationship, they say, what are you talking about? But then they get what your drift is. You know what I mean?
So it's a term everybody knows and everybody sort of understands. And as long as you can speak about it in a sensible way, it's better to have, you can call it whatever you want. You can not call it something and you still have the phenomenon. You could call it something else. You could call it a proper name like Bob. It wouldn't change the phenomenon, but why not use a term that people are familiar with and you can get somewhere with? Is it, you know,
there's some people that rule out the term like alcoholism. And then I say, George McGovern's daughter died on the street drunk after coming out of rehab or a halfway house. What would you say she died of?
Yeah.
What word would you use? Alcoholism seems to be a pretty convenient way of describing her state of being.
Yeah. All right. So that was our Q&A for now. I encourage people to please keep writing in. And that was a
we
really
love questions.
last question. Yeah. Thanks, Stanton.
Au revoir.